Picture an orc, if you will. What do you see? Perhaps you see the skulking monsters from the Lord of the Rings, or maybe you see the towering creatures from the World of Warcraft. Either way, we all have perceptions on what makes an orc, but they usually fall into a few distinct categories. They're tough, they're green, they're muscular, and they're generally evil monsters. But ask anyone who plays an orc in a Dungeons & Dragons game, and you're likely going to get a very different answer. Players who control orc characters, in my experience anyway, tend to design their characters like they would do for any other species. The only major difference being the player will more than likely have to think about their character's relationship with having to live with prejudice. How Dungeons & Dragons deals with the historical depictions of orcs is a fascinating talking point on how latent and often unintentional racism dictates game design choices, even into the modern day. So, in this episode, I'm going to explore the history of the orc in fantasy literature and how it pertains to gameplay mechanics that still affect games of Dungeons & Dragons today. Welcome to RPG Matters. And I just want to warn listeners and viewers that this episode does come with a content warning, as I'll be discussing historical depictions of racism and will more than likely end up using anachronistic racist terms, so just be aware of that. The term orc can be traced back as far as the 10th century to various different root words, such as the Latin word orcus. Their definitions can be loosely grouped together under similar categories as meaning a nefarious creature, such as a goblin, a spectre, a hell devil, a devouring monster, or a petulant, evil person. The term Orcneus turns up in the epic Anglo-Saxon tale of Beowulf as one of the tribes condemned by God, along with elves and etins, aka giants. Orcs begin to pop up in 16th and 17th century fairy tales, featuring prominently in Italian poet and fairy tale collector Giambattista Basile's retelling of old folk tales, which describes orcos as large, tusked, mannish beasts who can speak, live in dark forests, and eat humans. Then along came Tolkien. In addition to being the forebearers of a high fantasy genre and a grand tale of good versus evil, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, especially the latter, are treatises on history, language, and storytelling. Tolkien poured his fascination of history, ancient languages, and European folklore and tales into the creation of his fantasy world, Middle-earth. In a world filled with creatures deeply rooted in folklore, it should come as no surprise that Tolkien wanted to provide his own interpretations of our subject creatures. It was with Tolkien that the modern spelling of orc was introduced into the wider discourse, and also established how popular culture has come to perceive the creatures. Tolkien viewed orcs as being inherently evil creatures, following the whims and commands of the Dark Lords Morgoth and Sauron with unflinching fealty. They are depicted in Tolkien's books as brutish and outrightly ugly creatures, with commenters theorising this was done to contrast orcs to the righteous elves to clearly represent the conflicting sides of evil and good. Further, their primary language is that of black speech, a harsher language than that of elves, which many characters in The Lord of the Rings famously do not want to hear. So far, all well and good. However, the waters get muddy when Tolkien gets into descriptions of the orcs, and this passage is derived from a letter Tolkien sent, so it's actually not featured directly in the books, but these are Tolkien's own words. The orcs are squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the, to Europeans, least lovely Mongol types. Yeah, that's a big yikes. Sci-fi and fantasy echoing racist sentiments is nothing new. If you've ever watched the original series of Star Trek, you'll recognise that the Klingons are very East Asian in design, which codes them as being other to the 1960s audience that invariably draws upon the racial stereotype of the Fu Manchu and contemporary fears of communism. And just to be clear, I don't think Tolkien was willfully racist. He was very much a man of his time, and as such he reflected the deep-seated prejudice and racism inherent in the left-behinds of the British Empire. In his fantastic two-part essay on the racist implications of orcs, link in the description, James Mendes Hodds writes that Tolkien synthesized orcs' nature from various traditional characterizations, not of mythical beings, but of real-life humans. Some of those characterizations come from popular European conceptions of the greatest threats to Western civilization. Others came from pseudo-scientific frameworks of racism, some of which Tolkien would have encountered in his academic training. But Tolkien would meet the most germane theory to his orcs in his military service with the British Army, the fallacy of the martial race. Mendes further clarifies that what Tolkien described as least lovely Mongol types morphed from a historic depiction and fear of invading barbarians encroaching on civilized society into that of the Yellow Peril, Hun becoming a racial slur for Chinese people. Comicbook.com writer Christian Hoffer wrote that Tolkien's depiction of orc culture as a monolithic society of evil, human-like creatures became a standard element in epic fantasy. Over time, various artists and authors used elements of various real-world, non-European cultures when depicting orcs in books and other media, thus solidifying the idea that orcs were a reflection of non-European races, which is incredibly problematic. Couple that with the fact that the other evil races of Middle-earth are people of colour, such as the Harad and Easterlings, and well, that's another yikes for me, guys. And this is something where the Peter Jackson film adaptations walk a very thin line. It's really hard to get past the fact that, yes, they are creatures of colour in a world filled with white dudes, and that all the other villains are coded as African, or Middle Eastern, or Maori stereotypes. The ultimate takeaway here is that Tolkien viewed orcs as inherently evil creatures and drew upon deeply set European prejudices of others and barbarians to mark them as alien to our heroes, and how since then the concept of an invader or a barbarian has evolved into contemporary fears and concerns. As The Lord of the Rings became consumed into popular culture, the creatures featured in the novel became synonymous with their various attributes. Elves are old, wise and fair, dwarves are stout, hardy, grim folk, hobbits love to eat, be merry and are great at sneaking, and so on. And our beloved orcs became synonymous with the evil, mindless and stupid creatures of the Dark Lord. So when Dungeons & Dragons creators Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson began to design the very first edition of the game, they knew they needed to have staples of a fantasy genre in the game that players would recognise. Whilst Gygax has stated that the various influences of D&D were far and wide, downplaying the influence of Tolkien early on in the game's development, he admitted in later life that Middle-earth had a huge impact on him. And as such, a lot of the tropes created by Tolkien carry over into the gaming space, which includes, you guessed it, that orcs are inherently evil, stupid, and monstrous creatures with no capacity for good, which is then carried over into the game design. If I have any problems with D&D as a game, it is its absolutisms, the alignment system, the nature of the gods, and the inherent characteristics of creatures and races, which is what we're going to spend the rest of the episode talking about now. So the question becomes, how does this all affect Dungeons & Dragons exactly? Well, first we need to talk a bit about character creation. A key part of creating any Dungeons & Dragons character is selecting your race. As a 5th edition, there are literally dozens of races you can play as, from classic fantasy races such as elves and dwarves, to more unconventional creatures such as Arakora, a personal favourite of mine who are sort of like a bird-like people, not dissimilar to the Rito in the Legend of Zelda series, and Grungs, who are small anthropomorphized frogs. Think of Frog from Chrono Trigger as an example. After selecting your race, you then look up what the racial bonuses are, which usually take the form of some special abilities and stat boosts to either strength, intelligence, constitution, charisma, dexterity, and wisdom. For example, if you want to play as a Dragonborn, you enjoy a +2 to your strength and a +1 to your charisma. And this is where it all enters a tricky talking point. The concept that races have inherently better skills than others, such as charisma or intelligence, has nasty real-world implications when you consider the history of racism and eugenics in still very recent and still occurring history. Especially when one learns that any player who wants to play an orc in the standard Dungeons & Dragons 5e must take a -1 to their intelligence modifier. That's another yikes, guys. To summarise, we will cycle back to Hoffer's article, where he states that Dungeons & Dragons and many other fantasy games tend to describe races as monolithic entities that all share the same physical characteristics and cultural beliefs. This is reflected both in the racial attribute score bonuses that each race gets in D&D. Many players see games like Dungeons & Dragons as codifying and normalising the use of racial stereotypes, which leads to both racist situations at the gaming table and encourages racist attitudes getting adopted by some players. For instance, a player using the Orc race found in Volvo's Guide to Monsters means that they take a -1 penalty to their intelligence score, which means that the smartest level 1 Orc will always be less intelligent than the smartest level 1 human. When translated to real-world discussions about races and cultures, it can be easily argued that this pushes an incredibly racist and outdated viewpoint. This is something that is hotly debated today amongst fan circles and stems from a long, muddy history of D&D never quite doing justice to our erstwhile orcs. Orcs do not feature at all as a playable race in the Player's Handbook of the 5th edition and latest edition of the game. They do, however, appear in a supplementary volume called Volvo's Guide to Monsters, which describes them as being only able to develop a limited capacity for empathy, love, and compassion. And as you can imagine, when the internet saw this line, people lost their shit. And to make things even worse, despite the aforementioned -1 to intelligence, they also get bonuses to strength and constitution, and abilities such as aggressive, menacing, and powerful build. Remember that connection to least lovely Mongol types, fears of European invasions by barbarians, and how this is then warped into contemporary concerns about others encroaching upon white society? Yeah, you can probably see how this feeds into a lot of continuing very real-world racism and stereotypes. Returning to Mendes' articles, he argues that D&D Orcs have now evolved and are now codified to reflect racist fears of black people and Native Americans, with the Player's Handbook drawing upon terminology associated with quote-unquote natives, hordes, terror, tribe, barbaric, savage, all terms used to describe orcs in the book. And as he further points out, your DM may not even allow you to play as an orc in the first place, being from a supplementary book. And I do want to talk in brief about the long and confusing history of the half-orc in this game. The half-orc variant was introduced as early as the very first edition of the game, and have come in and out of various editions since. they were cut entirely from Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, but reappeared in that edition's second version, just with a -2 to Charisma, along with a couple +1 bonuses in other traits. Half-Orcs suffered even more in 3rd edition, where they were cast as essentially big, dumb, unplayable brutes, taking 2 negative penalties to Intelligence and Charisma. The Half-Orc class was abandoned for the initial version of the 4E's player handbook, to some controversy from fans, before eventually returning in a modified form that still didn't quite satisfy. 5E seems to have finally struck the right balance for the race, at least mechanically. Thankfully, they don't have to take negative bonuses anymore, but the player still has to deal with the baggage of explaining the backstory of how this character came into the world, considering the inherently evil nature of the Orc, the barbaric tone of their description, and then also to get into really nasty areas about the implications of how your half-orc came into this world, and the details of the union of your father and mother. So, what's being done to try and combat the history of negativity surrounding not only the Orc as a fantasy creature in the wider zeitgeist, and in the various new editions of Dungeons & Dragons? I mean, I could talk in brief about the Netflix film Bright's attempts to deal with racism via the Orcs being cast as down-and-out African Americans, but I won't go there, because it's childishly simple and ultimately dumb. So dumb. If you've not seen it, I would say watch the Lindsay Ellis video, because she explains why it's so dumb. But the concept of applying that isn't bad, because what's happened since is various game designers have attempted to address the racist history of the Orc within the game. So, for example, the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount cleverly circumnavigates the whole issue via a reframing of that troubling backstory and that trope of orcs being inherently evil. The orcs and half-orcs of Matt Mercer's Exandria world are given an interesting backstory, which tells of how the blood of a ruiner flows in the veins of all orcs, driving them to commit acts of terrible violence and anger. Orcs call this fury Haragrumph, or the Curse of Ruin, and use it to refer to everything from battle rage to a bad temper. Half-orcs are said to have inherited the blood of a ruiner, and to carry the same bloodlust and fury that orcs do. Orcs and half-orcs do feel a certain pull towards violence and anger, but the simple truth is that there is no Curse of Ruin. No supernatural power drives orcs to kill. Rather, they are simply victims of the same selfish, violent impulses that corrupt all mortal beings. So there you have it. Author Matt Mercer and the other game designers are keen to make it clear that orcs are not inherently evil creatures and are not driven to do evil things. And any lingering fear of the racists from the rest of the populace of Exandria comes from racist assumptions about their origins. So all in all, I would call this a fairly nifty and responsible way of addressing the unfortunate history of orcs in popular culture and the game in general, but also a smart way of moving forward. There's still the menacing and the aggressive attribute in the book, but if you don't want that, then well, you could just drop it. And this is supposing that the game even should continue with racial bonuses. The D&D developers and Wizards of the Coast have clearly recognised that this has been an unfortunate problem with the core part of the game for a while now, and perhaps now is the time to consider the longevity of the game. D&D designer James Hayek suggested an interesting variant to 5e, in which racial stat bonuses are eradicated, and instead suggests a change of receiving the bonuses based on either 1. Additional training your character undertakes, or 2. The bonuses come from your class or your background. After all, doesn't it make sense for a fighter who has trained really hard to get a bonus to their strength, or someone who has succeeded at becoming a wizard receiving a +2 to their intelligence? I feel that this is a more responsible way of 1. Getting players to play as the characters that they want to play as, with no limitations or min-maxing to make the best version of your character mechanically. I think often people will just pick a particular race just because they get that racial stat bonus, which happens to play into the sort of character they want to play mechanically in the game. And second, and most importantly, it just avoids the awkwardness of the issues that derive from the whole concept of racial bonuses. Hayek notes that feedback of this concept revealed that some players felt that the second option could affect making characters of a certain class feel homogenous to one another, but either way, Hayek admits that the way things are currently done needs to be rethought. The conversation is happening, and the changes are being made to newer modules such as the Wildmount book, and this all suggests that things are changing, and who knows what shape this will all take with the 6th edition. So, what have we learned, and what can we do going forward? Well, stamp out racism and unconscious bias for a start. But what should we as players be thinking about when we sit at the table to play a game of D&D, or indeed any other fantasy or science fiction game, or just any tabletop RPG? Well, that nothing is created in a vacuum. Everything has a context, and there's a reason and origin behind every piece of popular culture we consume. We need to be able to identify and talk about the history of racism in our media, and how we can improve ourselves going forward. D&D and role-playing games in general are a wonderful canvas to celebrate and inhabit a diverse world of race, gender and sexualities. So if you're a DM, and you have a player who wants to play as an orc, let them. Don't be afraid to change the rules if you fundamentally disagree with D&D's interpretation of orcs or any of the other races. Use recent developments in the redesign and recontextualization of orcs as your lighthouse, and get your players to embody the characters they want to play as. This episode ended up becoming a lot more timely than expected, with the recent developments in the USA with the murder of George Floyd, a victim of systematic oppression, police brutality, and the very, very real spectre of racism that continues to hang over us all. As such, we need to be critical of the media that we consume. We need to all collectively learn and work together to create a world that we want to live in. And as such, our games should be a safe space to craft the equal and wonderful, diverse world we all want to live in. And that's it for this episode of RPG Matters. Episode 2, and I'm already depressed. This episode is something I've really wanted to get out for a while now, and it's kind of part of why I wanted to start this whole series in general, to be honest. It was from a discussion I had online with some friends, and the topic fascinated me, and I wanted to do a bit of a deep dive into it. I mean, I ultimately want listeners to be encouraged to get up and play Dungeons and Dragons, and, in a way, I hope it doesn't put people off, because there is a history of negativity with it. But like anything, it's a case of addressing it, learning from it, and the best thing about Dungeons and Dragons, unlike a film or a book that's got that's really good, it's got racist undertones, you can expunge it. You can think of clever ways of working with the game master and getting rid of those elements. It's very I would say diverse, Ben. It's a game which lets you, it's very malleable, is what I'm trying to say. So be kind to each other. It's tough going at the moment. Everyone's feeling it, and what's happening in the USA is terrible. And as I said at the end of the episode, we should all feel that we can all work together, really, to create the world that we want to live in. So, stay safe, be kind to each other, never stop learning, and Black Lives Matter.